Welcome to the MCC Brussels podcast, where we cut through the noise of bureaucratic spin and shine a light on the real battles shaping Europe's future. I am your host, John O'Brien, Head of Communications at MCC Brussels. I'm filling in for Jacob Reynolds. In this week's episode, we're zooming in on the slow-motion collapse of the European Union's open border fantasy, looking into yet another political witch hunt against Hungary, and examining an EU elite increasingly rattled, whether by Trump's tariffs or their internal scandal. First up, the Poland-Germany border checks. Is Schengen imploding? Poland has reintroduced border controls with Germany and Lithuania, citing growing concerns over illegal migration flows. It's not acting alone. 11 EU member states now have some form of internal border control. Brussels is trying to downplay it. But the message is clear. Schengen is breaking down. The ideal of free movement is crashing against the reality of uncontrolled migration and national interests. Is Poland protecting Europe's borders or simply doing what Brussels refuses to do? Next up, let's look at the Danish EU presidency. Good old Legoland, Denmark, is now holding the EU presidency and is wasting no time targeting Hungary. Their goal, trigger Article 7 and strip Budapest of its voting rights, all because Hungary refuses to bend the knee and align with Brussels on Ukraine and so-called rule of law standards. It's a dangerous precedent. EU leadership using institutional tools to silence dissenting member states. Is this governance or political revenge against the sovereign nation that dares to chart its own course based upon the views of its own voters? Finally, I'm inviting you, the viewers and listeners, to choose your favorite crisis, Trump's tariffs or von der Leyen's trouble, because this week the EU faces pressure on two fronts. Trump's July the 9th tariff threat has the EU scrambling to avoid a fresh trade war. So far, there's no deal. Just vague promises and deadline extensions. Brussels is on a back foot, and Washington is calling the shots. Meanwhile, the dream queen, Ursula von der Leyen, may have survived her no-confidence vote, but the storm isn't over. From Pfizergate to secretive backroom deals, critics across the spectrum are sharpening their knives. Her leadership may be intact, but her authority is anything but. This is MCC Brussels, principled, provocative, and unafraid to say what others won't. So let's dive in. Helping us untangle these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by two super smart colleagues, Richard Schenk, Research Fellow, and Professor Frank Furedi, Executive Director of MCC Brussels. With Poland reintroducing border checks and 11 EU countries now defying the Schengen rules, the idea of borderless Europe looks increasingly like a failed experiment. Richard, I want to ask you, Poland seems to be taking real action to defend its border. Why is Berlin reacting with such outrage instead of fixing its own failed asylum policies?
Well, we have been told by many governments and elites in Europe, all across Europe, that migration is kind of like a miracle cure for economic and demographic problems in Europe. But as we see over the years, and many governments actually have realized this, that migration in its current form is a burden on the social welfare systems in the states. This is also the case in Germany, but also in Austria. Some of the biggest countries who are like kind of like magnets for migration. They see that they don't have the money to finance this current migration system, but because this is not an honest political change, of course, they are actually at the same time pointing the fingers at the countries who are defending the European Union's external borders, Poland, but also Hungary, and they are reprimanded constantinously, while these countries, Germany in this case, are passing on the hot potato back to them. They don't want to have the migrants, and this is the whole moral and the breakdown of the system. Like this constant. This narrative is coming crashing down. This house of cards is falling apart, and we see the dawn of this current system, I think.
Frank, isn't Schengen now more of a liability than a benefit, especially when internal borders are being reinstated to fix problems caused by the lack of external ones?
Or the real problem are the external borders. And the real problem has always been Germany, was in the forefront of normalizing illegal migration. And it should be said that Germany is playing a double game now because of domestic pressure. They're trying to kind of export migrants from Germany to Poland, and the Poles are reacting quite naturally. But the Germans, have not yet gone all the way to acknowledging their role. They're simply reacting to the domestic pressure that exists within Germany. And as a result of that, what's happening is that Schengen is on paper still what it used to be. But at the same time, people are realizing that if you have weak external borders, then you're going to have to tighten up borders within Europe, which is a tragedy. Because Schengen was a good idea. Mm-hmm. It was a great idea to have free movement of people in Europe. But that presupposed that there was the will on the part of these different European countries to take their border security seriously. And it seems to me that until that problem is solved, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter whether there's Schengen or there isn't Schengen. The problem of illegal mass migration is going to get worse and worse. And its consequences aren't just simply economic, which is what they worried about in the first instance. It's also political, and it will lead to the destabilization of European societies. And I predict that any country in the EU that doesn't really take migration more seriously, doesn't really take decisive steps, aren't going to last for very long in the future.
Good point. Richard, should conservative governments push for a formal rethink or suspension of Schengen in light of what Frank says until the EU can guarantee that we actually have external border security?
Well, we see that the Schengen system was invented in a completely different era, end of the 1980s. The EU, basically back then, the Schengen zone was West Germany, Italy, and France, and the Benelux states. So their only relevant external border was the Iron Curtain, which was a very heavily policed external border of the back then European communities. And this system has broken down because now not only are the external borders much larger, but they are not policed in any comparable manner at all. So obviously we need to fix this, and also we need to, and it's quite easy actually to fix this because, for example, still today there are a lot of NGOs financing illegal migration, supporting migration across the Mediterranean, getting government money from the EU and from other governments. This is a very easy thing to shut down. Then we have this whole completely weird legal system that was set up. The European Union became responsible for asylum by the end of the 2000s and early 2010s, and it has created a legal system that makes basically impossible for national governments to manage migration. So not only has the EU changed its asylum policy, but we should establish a completely new one, which most likely will go to in direction of a Rwanda model, that people will not get the asylum claims processed in Europe anymore.
Mm-hmm. Frank, are we finally, with what's happening now, is this the beginning of the end? Are we finally seeing the end of the EU's borderless utopia? And is that a good thing for national sovereignty? Is that a good thing for security?
Well, at the moment, we're still taking baby steps in that direction, because none of the governments, and certainly not the EU, are prepared to acknowledge that the border issue, mass migration, is actually a security problem. And they're not prepared to acknowledge that it's a security problem, because a security problem, when national security at stake, demands, I'm afraid to say, a military response. Mm-hmm. And until you have a military response and treat people who want to cross your borders as not just migrants, but as potential enemies, people that you want to stop, until you acknowledge that and take decisive measures in that direction, the problem will not go away. The problem will just simply acquire a different and a new form. So I think that the solution in the meantime is for nation states to do what Hungary and to a lesser extent Poland is trying to do, which is to essentially just close its borders and find a new way of managing people coming in and people going out. And then make it very, very clear that, we're not prepared to sacrifice our national security for the incompetence that Brussels has been breeding and is refusing to acknowledge.
Frank, I'm going to come back to you again on our next issue, because Denmark has made triggering Article 7 against Hungary the flagship priority of Denmark's presidency. A clear warning to member states that challenge the Brussels ideology. I want to ask you, Frank, since Denmark is openly targeting Hungary on Article 7, does this confirm that the EU is now using rule of law as a political weapon?
I think it is, because I cannot for 1 minute imagine that the Danish government dreamt up this particular strategy. I cannot imagine that the Danish government decided that this will be its defining profile once it acquires the European presidency. And I think there's been a lot of discussions going on in Europe. And what the discussions really amount to is, how can we escalate the pressure that we're placing on Hungary? How can we create a situation where the kind of pressure we're putting on Hungary can destabilize the government? Because at the end of the day, what they are trying to do is not only to teach the Hungarian government a lesson, which is what they've been doing for some time, but to go a few steps beyond that. So it's not an accident that they just recently announced that they're withholding the money, the serious amount of money that Hungary ought to have, that they continue to withhold that funds from Hungarians. But pretty much at the same time, the Danes are upping the stakes in terms of the lawfare, in terms of legal pressure. And I think the ultimate goal, what they are really trying to get at, is to create a situation where EU pressure creates a dynamic that the opposition to the Hungarian government could benefit from. In other words, what they are fantasizing about is a kind of new equivalent of a color revolution taking place within Hungarian society. And that's how I would read the Danish representation.
Mm-hmm. Richard, Article 7 would take away Hungary's vote, Hungary's voice, and the voice of its people. If a government refuses to endorse EU migration quotas or Ukraine's fast-track accession, should it really face this threat, Article 7, of being stripped of your vote?
If they would really take this rule of law issues seriously, or European values seriously as it is in the indictment that they have issued in the Hungary regarding Hungary, then a lot of European countries would be on the bench, would be under suspicion as well, would be under investigation as well. So they are setting an extremely dangerous precedent here, because many other countries also have rule of law issues. If you look closely, why Hungary is so much under scrutiny, and this is a new thing that emerged in the last half year, that not only the Danish presidency but also the European Commission, basically in its communications, have interwoven Article 7 with Ukraine, but also with migration. So it's officially not only about rule of law anymore. And I mean, it's not only Ukraine and the fast track. They can exert pressure on Hungary, but honestly, I don't see the political strategy behind it. Because even if they would succeed, I think on these issues, they don't have majorities in Western European countries either. Mm-hmm. So it basically just this fast track procedures that they want to unroll. This pressure on critics of these measures is not going to work at all. It's more like a desperate move, politically desperate move. They're simulating being in action, being in power, setting the agenda, but actually they are driven by their fears.
Frank, famously, the European Commission doesn't have the backing of voters. It doesn't have the support of the demos. What message does it send voters in countries like Hungary and Slovakia that their democratic choices don't matter if Brussels disagrees?
Well, I think there's an interesting issue here, because although the European Commission has got no real legitimacy and has got no organic links with the electorates in the nation state, it is nevertheless seen, even by Hungarians and by Slovakians, as an important institution. So in Hungary, a very large percentage of the population thinks that staying in the EU is a good thing, and it's important. And therefore, you got this situation where a lot of countries have come to depend on the EU as an integral part of their life and their survival. So the EU can use the fact that it is seen as a fairly indispensable institution as a way of mitigating the kind of reaction that its behavior provokes. So the way that I see it is that a lot of citizens are getting really fed up, absolutely fed up with what the EU is doing, and regard the way they infringe on their sovereignty with contempt. But at the same time, the EU is also able to appeal and resonate with a certain section of the electorate who basically believe that the EU can be a potential savior or play that kind of a role. It's pretty much a rerun of what happened in the before the old regime change occurred, where people looked to the West and to the EU as the solution to the problems that they have. That kind of attitude still prevails, and the opposition in Hungary, Slovakia, is really playing on that. So they're playing the EU card all the time. Basically, their big message is that the EU is behind us and is against the government. Now, whether that will actually lead to electoral success is an open question, but I suspect at a certain point what will happen is that this comprador political class that is more dependent on the EU than on their own nation is going to come a cropper. But nevertheless, it is a closely fought struggle that is taking place, and the struggle is going to intensify in the next 6-7 months.
Richard, considering the moves by Denmark, should Hungary and its allies start building a formal counterbloc inside the EU to resist this type of ideological centralization?
So what do we say on the bloc? I think in many national governments there are reasonable forces who see that this behavior that you single out one member state and just this is basically completely contrary to the political culture of the European Union, but also especially with the European Union's Council. And if they would do this with all the 27 member states, then the entire system would break down. So you can appeal to some forces of reason within the council, and to a certain limited extent this works. On some issues like nuclear energy, you can build case by case alliances. So it's not by far not the case that Hungary is completely alone in this case. Just often enough there are countries who hide behind Hungary as well. Just, because Ukraine, for example, we mentioned it, is a politically a hot potato. So many countries know that at home they don't have the majorities to push forward Ukraine's membership, so they just let Orban do the public fighting for them.
Same question to you, Frank. But considering the dirty tricks, considering the type of undemocratic push that's going on, is it time for Hungary to get together with allies and defend themselves?
Well, Hungary has been trying to do that anyway. And in a sense, there used to be a much closer alliance between Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland, which unfortunately, with the loss of the election in Poland, has unraveling. Hungary is looking towards the Czech Republic, where there's going to be elections there. And there's a very good chance that Babiš, a person that's close to Hungary, might get elected. So that's something they're looking towards. And I think Hungary looks to the Patriot group and the parties there and really desperately hopes that some of those parties will get into government sooner rather than later. But Hungary is going to have a two-track policy. On the one hand, building a bloc and alliances of like-minded parties and governments. And at the same time, it's going to use diplomatic stuff in the way that Richie was explaining, whereby you try to form an alliance on the Green Deal, for example, or on nuclear deal. There are certain policies on which Hungary is able to forge a limited alliance, a very limited alliance, and go forward. But the other point that's important to bear in mind is that many of these policies are not at all popular. So the Ukraine accession, is not really popular by the majority of the governments, I would imagine, because they're all calculating the economic cost.
Yeah.
What happens if Ukraine comes in? So as long as Hungary is opposing it, they can just kind of posture and position themselves as a friend of Ukraine and make all kinds of promises. But in their hearts of hearts, they know that bringing in Ukraine would be analogous to try to bring in Turkey. And they did the same thing with Turkey. They were saying Turkey should come in and, it's going to be great. But there was no way that the EU was going to allow that to occur.
Good point. Our last two issues today, I want to look at some of the crises that are going on. And we seem to be in a permanent state of crisis all the time. But Richard, with Trump's tariff deadline hitting and no deal in sight. The EU looks weak and unprepared again in the face of hardline negotiation. Richard, Trump is forcing Brussels to the negotiating table. He has done more to challenge EU trade complacency than the entire European Commission has. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. The EU Commission is still stuck in the 2010s, early 2010s. They tried to come up with this giant, huge, detailed trade deals. Be it Mercosur is currently one of the big them that are negotiated over decades, and that they are. And this system basically doesn't work since 15 years. For 15 years now, they have been no new big trade deals with the European Union, and it's kind of really a threat, life-threatening to the European Union, because one of the big narratives that this union was founded upon was that it provides us with better negotiating position in regarding trade deals. And currently what we see that we are negotiating basically from the same position that not only the UK, but even Thailand and some other countries have similar conditions with the US now on the table than we are. So this is basically a complete the last wake-up call for the European Commission that we are in a new era.
Does the whole Trump tariff threat, Frank, remind us that the EU is still addicted to protectionism and technocratic deals instead of pursuing real economic sovereignty and competitiveness?
Yeah, it's a bit like that. I think that the EU has always been addicted to, for example, institutionalizing internal tariffs. So there's a very extensive tariff system within Europe itself, never mind what the Americans are doing. It's addicted to continually expanding the domain of regulation, and it uses its regulatory instruments as if it was trying to get deals with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it got away with that for a while, particularly in relation to digital technology and in relation to the social media organizations. But now it realizes that it's going to have to change its way. I think that the most interesting thing about the EU reaction to Trump is its slothfulness, the slowness within which the response has occurred. Even someone like Juncker, the old president of the EU, has made a point. Why are you guys being so slow? Why aren't you rising to the occasion? It's almost like there's a kind of lack of will, a lack of bravery to kind of formulate a particular kind of policy, and they're waiting always for Trump to make the latest pronouncements. And I think when that kind of strategy is painfully dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Richard, finally, Ursula von der Leyen beat the no confidence vote this week, but with Pfizergate and the political backlash growing, her authority is clearly crumbling. Von der Leyen survived, but her legitimacy is not what it used to be. How long can an unelected Commission president cling to power like this?
Well, how Ursula von der Leyen got into this position first was that she created an alliance in the European Parliament in her favor out of the European People's Party, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens. And the big problem with this was that at the same time, she knew that many of the policies that are currently wreaking havoc on Europe's economy can only be undone with the help of the political right. So she played on both sides, tried to play both sides. And she underestimated that, for example, the Social Democrats in Europe are on the brink of eradication. So their last hope is Pedro Sanchez's government in Spain, which is on the brink of collapse basically every day. So the political left is really keen to keep the cordon sanitaire in place. It's their last hope for being in power, because they have lost so many national elections over the last years. And on the political right, how should the groups on the political right maintain their integrity if they're doing political deals with the political left? So this entire political strategy, I think, was doomed to fail in the very beginning. The EPP just reverted to some very primitive power play tactics, but they had no clear strategy at all what they are doing.
Frank, finally with you, Pfizergate exposed how deals are made in secret, how secrecy operates in Brussels. Where is the accountability with people like Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission? Does accountability matter to them? Are they not embarrassed by the situation that they create time and time again?
I don't think they are embarrassed. I think they care a little bit about the optics. And what they like to do is to kind of invent a series of displacement activities, which they are not bad at. I actually thought that von der Leyen was quite effective in the way she dealt with her opposition. It reminded me of a teacher who's facing a classroom rebellion, but at the end of the day, basically puts all the children in their place. And the reason for that is, and this is why they don't particularly care about the absence of transparency, is they know that they got the EPP in their pocket no matter what.
Yep.
I mean, they're just there. They also know that the rest of the left and also, people like Renew are not going to risk a situation that destabilizes the present arrangements from which they all benefit from. At the end of the day, they all benefit from that. But to her credit, and this is something that's sometimes overlooked, she has managed to split the ECR, a section of the right wing. And she's managed to create a situation where at least some of the ECR members, particularly, sort of the Fratelli party, has ended up supporting her against the rest of the ECR members. So she's actually much cleverer, or that her advisors are much cleverer than people give them credit for. But then, of course, they know a very simple fact, which is that her side, whatever the political differences, survive on the basis of maintaining the existing arrangements within Brussels. That's what they got to maintain by hook or crook. And to do that, they will do anything that's necessary, and they will have rebellions and mini rebellions, and then people will make big speeches. But at the end of the day, nothing is going to happen from that quarter, because their survival depends on its perpetuation.
Frank Friede, Richard Schenk, thank you very much for joining us today, for sharing your knowledge and giving your analysis. It really helps us. And thank you, our listeners and viewers. And thank you for joining us on the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm going to ask you, if you enjoyed today's show, leave a comment. Tell us what you think. We're interested what you make of these issues, as well as hearing from our expert panels. Also, give us a like, give us a thumbs up. And remember, share this podcast with your friends, your family, your colleagues. It's only by getting the word out there that we're going to make the type of difference that we want to. This is John O'Brien signing off for MCC Brussels.